Our daily Bible reading has us well into the book of 1 Samuel. And so each morning we are in 1 Samuel. We're almost into chapter 18 already. 1 Samuel has this really strong and good beginning with the birth of Samuel, with the prayers of his mother Hannah, with her devotion to the Lord, with the commitment of Samuel to the Lord. Soon, however, hard times begin to kind of tumble out as you read through the book. Samuel's own sons are abusive of the tabernacle and the people who come there to worship and offer sacrifices. The only bright spot is young Samuel, who is taken to Eli and kind of as an apprentice works under Eli and learns the ways of the tabernacle and sacrifices. But the people then are in such turmoil. And really that statement that you read in the book of Judges is that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Is that a frightening statement to you? It should be, because it was a frightening time. And it's hard to believe that you read through the book of Judges and all of the horrible sin and just the gross sin that's there. And then the book of Ruth is this bright spot. And you have to read carefully, but when Ruth begins, it tells you that during the time of the Judges, the famine comes, and Ruth and the family that she becomes a part of, Naomi and her sons and husband, go to Moab. And that leads to the book of Ruth, which leads to Boaz marrying Ruth, and they end up in the lineage of King David, which kind of brings us back to where we are in Samuel. During the days of Samuel, the Philistines are dominating the Israelites. They are beating them militarily. They are dominating them and forcing them into hard labor. And the people grow restless. And their answer is that they approach Samuel and they want a king just like all the nations around them. We want a king. We want a king. Samuel tries to dissuade them, knowing God was the one who was to be their king and was their king. Finally, God tells Samuel to relent, to give in, and anoint a king over Israel. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, as the people approach Samuel again, you read these verses. 1 Samuel 8, verses 6 and 7, it says, "But the thing," meaning the people requesting to have a king, "the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, 'Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them.'" Now, it's not hard to understand why Samuel felt rejected, because they're saying, "Give us a king to judge us." Samuel was the judge. Samuel was actually a judge, a prophet, a priest. Before very long, Samuel is directed to Saul, and Saul is pointed out as to the one that is to be anointed as the first human king over Israel. And when Samuel sees him, it is pointed out in 1 Samuel chapter 9 that Saul has that outward appeal. This is what it says. 1 Samuel chapter 9, first two verses. "There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Becherath, son of Aphiah, Benjamite, a man of wealth, and he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among all the people of Israel who was more handsome than he. And from his shoulders upward, he was taller than all the people." He stood out, didn't he? and he is the one who Samuel anoints. And Saul begins to serve his time as a king with great promise, great hope. He gathers the men of war together, and they have great defeats of the Philistines. Everything seems to be going very, very well. But it's not long before some very fatal flaws begin to surface in the life of Saul. While there are many, many good leaders in the Bible we can study, Saul ends up being an example that we can read and study of how not to do things. Here are some things we should not do, right? So I'm really compiling a lot of 1 Samuel chapters here, so just follow along. I'll be reading verses as we go through. Following a major defeat of the Philistines, the people are to gather, and Samuel is asked to join them at a little town where we all would like to live, at Michmash, right? Michmash, and present sacrifices to the Lord. Samuel does not arrive quickly, and Saul becomes impatient. And he goes ahead and offers the sacrifice himself, something he's forbidden to do. Just about the time he's offered the sacrifice, Samuel, who was, as I said, judge, prophet, priest, was the one to deliver and make the sacrifices. Samuel shows up. And so very, very early in the kingship of Saul, in chapter 13, 1 Samuel 13, verse 13. Is that not scary? 1 Samuel 13:13. Samuel says to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God with which he commanded you, for then the Lord would have established your kingdom forever." When I read that just a couple days ago, I stopped. We all know that it's the lineage of David, you'd say the Davidic kingship that is established forever. But here God is saying to Saul, if he had done rightly, it would have been his lineage. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but not now. So one lesson we can learn very quickly from Saul. In this occasion, in 1 Samuel 13, he acts foolishly. He acted out of frustration. He acted out of a lack of patience. And he also acted with disregard when it came to the handling of the things of God. In this case, the sacrifices. Now, I could ask you this question. Does it seem too harsh that God rejects Saul over this? Is that not just a small thing? Saul offers the sacrifices? Of course not. It was a big thing. He was directly disobeying a word of God. It is a big problem. So he's treated the things of God, he's treated Samuel, the prophet of God, the priest of God, with contempt. What he has done is he has devalued the calling of God upon Samuel, and he's devaluated the consecrated things of God, the sacrifices. 1 Samuel 13 is just the proverbial tip of an iceberg when it comes to King Saul. That's just the beginning. But it's the beginning of the end. This behavior continues, and it grows worse, much worse. By the time we arrive at chapter 15, Saul again disobeys a direct command of God. God, through Samuel, tells Saul to muster the troops and to go down and to really execute what is a judgment from way back during the Exodus, when the Amalekites came out and went to war against the Israelites who were just getting into the Exodus. And it's pronounced at that time that God will judge them. And now that time comes, and Samuel tells Saul to take the troops and to obliterate, to pronounce judgment on all of the Amalekites, King Agag, and everything that's in their cities. Now that's extreme. So Saul attacks, but he doesn't do all that God said. He takes King Agag of the Amalekites captive, and he keeps back the best of the oxen and the best of the sheep, and makes his way to where he claims that he's going to offer them then as sacrifices to the people. It's selective obedience. When Samuel comes, he just confronts him over this lack of obedience. And it's in 1 Samuel 15. Listen to these verses. Saul, he took Agag, the king of Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and the fattened calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. And a few verses later, Samuel confronts Saul over this disobedience, and he reemphasizes this failure of Saul to obey the word of the Lord. So the first was 1 Samuel 8, 9. Now we're in 1 Samuel 15, 22 and 23. And Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." Now, we saw part of that verse that we've read in there, quoted by Jesus on Sunday in Matthew 12, when they push the man with the withered hand to the front and ask him if it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, what's better, having mercy, compassion, or offering sacrifices? And he says, God desires mercy, and obedience comes in that. So here is where Saul begins to try and make excuses. And he passes the blame. He said, well, he was afraid of the people, so thereby they took all the best of the oxen and the sheep, the lambs, the calves, and Agag. And then he says, well, we're going to offer them, And this is in that point where Samuel has, it's almost a very humorous line where Saul comes up and he says to Samuel, "Oh, blessed are you to the Lord God, and I've done all that God has told me to do." And Samuel says, "Oh, really? What's this lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep that I hear?" Samuel is then, as he departs from Saul, Samuel's really devastated by this turn of events, and God says, "Why do you keep grieving over Saul? I have rejected him." And then he tells Samuel, "You go to Bethlehem. You go to the house of Jesse. You call Jesse's sons forward, and you anoint the one that I point out to you as the next king for Israel." So Samuel learns a valuable lesson in this chapter 2. This is 1 Samuel 16. Because, again, the very first son of Jesse, Eliab, is tall and handsome and skilled, a man of war. And Samuel thinks, well, surely this must be the one. And God says, nope, not the one. Well, the next, nope, not the one. The next one, no, not the one. And after 7 come by, he asks Jesse, are these all your sons? Oh, yeah, but there's only one other one, and that's the little red-headed squirt. He's out watching the sheep. Well, bring him here. And God, of course, says, this is the one. That red-headed boy's name was David. I say red-headed because it says he was ruddy, which means red. And here's what Samuel learns in chapter 16, 1 Samuel. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I've rejected him, speaking of the first son. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Of course, the main subject of our lesson, Saul, is very, very, very unhappy about the anointing of David by Samuel. And David's life is now going to become a great challenge very quickly, very greatly, because of the actions of Saul. And actually, the reactions of Saul become one of those forces that shapes and impacts the life of David. Now, as you've probably learned, not all the Bible's put together in chronological calendar, date, time. Judges didn't follow that. Samuel is not following that. Jeremiah did not follow that chronological time. It kind of moves around. And you'll find the story then of David and Goliath kind of when he was younger and first meets up with King Saul, and King Saul is immediately attracted to David and brings him into his house. David plays the lyre and composes psalms that eases Saul's spirit. But this is what happens when David kills Goliath. David becomes very popular. And the more popular that David becomes, the more jealous that Saul becomes. And if you want to learn another lesson from Saul, you can't be jealous of other people's success, especially when David's success is attributed in Samuel to God. His victory over Goliath is because David is not claiming any physical strength or abilities that if God gives you into my hand, then today you'll die. And so David becomes more popular. Then Saul puts David in charge of some troops, and he kills Philistines and frees up Israel's oppression from that. David's popularity is increasing, and the more people love him, the more Saul despised him. And when they're returning home after some of those battles, a song of praise was written about Saul and David. And it says the women of the cities come out singing this song about them. And it simply says that Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000s. And Saul is furious. He cannot stand it if someone receives praise or more praise than he does. 1 Samuel 18, verses 8 and 9. This is Saul's response to the song of the women. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. Now, you probably don't have to know Hebrew to know that that word eye has a lot more meaning than he just happened to catch him in his line of sight, right? He eyed David. He eyed him suspiciously. He eyed him with anger and fear and jealousy. And later on in the same chapter, it tells you in 1 Samuel 18, verse 29, it says, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Which you want to talk about friction in the household, who becomes David's best friend? But Saul's son, Jonathan. Wow. Now, in the lineage, one of Saul's sons should have become the next king. Oh, well, let me see. That might have been Jonathan. But Jonathan, seems to very quickly step aside for David. Oh, there's one more thing I should add. Not only does Jonathan love David and they're best friends, one of Saul's daughters loves David. Wow. Now, Saul tries to give David his oldest daughter first, and David's like, no. I'm too lowly born of a person to be the son-in-law to the king, and he refuses. But David's also quite aware of Michal, and Michal's quite aware of David. And when the oldest daughter's given to someone else, then Michal is given to David, and they marry. And Saul's jealousy and all that continues to build. So these lessons we learn from Saul. In the midst of events, he's very, very quick to try and pass the blame to others. If you want people not to be around you, just get really proficient at trying to blame them for everything that goes wrong. So he regularly passes the blame when it was him. He resented and held a grudge against anyone who was more important in his own eyes. You want to see a church just unravel? Just be jealous of someone else getting some recognition. His own status was always his most important concern. Saul was always bigger in his own eyes than he was in anyone else's. And so his status was always his first concern. And the one quality that we learn of David when he was anointed king, God tells Samuel he's going to choose a man who is a man after his own heart. And that means David desired to please God. Of course, the sad story after that is even David falls way short of that pursuit when he becomes king. But it's interesting the lessons we can learn in the Old Testament. And so we need to learn to not fall into some of those same pitfalls that Saul fell into, passing the blame and being jealous of anybody else being recognized or anyone else being successful. A lot of leaders will surround themselves with people who are not going to be more proficient in anything than they are. And what they do is they doom the organization not to succeed. A good leader is not afraid of having people come in or take things that they're better at doing than they are and allow them to do them. And so, when young people come in and they're wanting to work and do things, you encourage them. You get them going. You try to, delegate. Let them take over and do those things. So those are some important lessons for us to learn. Saul, he wanted all the glory for himself, and he certainly wasn't interested in giving God the glory. And he ended up getting the judgment of God. And we know the final end that Saul comes to a very, very sad end.